converts, especially formerly enslaved people, who refashioned Swahili for their own purposes. Her work is great. Part of me just wanted to read it to all of you, but I decided that would be weird. But if you're interested in Swahili, you should get in touch with her. I mean, Mississippi State, rival, whatever, but her work is really interesting. But since I'm not her, since I'm the one who's here, I'm not going to talk about languages in Africa exactly. I'm going to talk about something else that I've spent more time thinking about, which is the language that people use to speak about Africa. And that's where I'll be focusing my remarks tonight. And I think that the topics are not the same, but they're connected because, as you all know, there is a tremendous diversity of languages spoken in Africa, as there is a tremendous diversity of every other aspect of human existence across a vast continent. And yet the language that people in the United States and elsewhere use to speak about Africa almost never reflects awareness of that diversity. The diversity of Africa, whether it's linguistic, social, political, whatever, is always grossly oversimplified, with the Nigerian author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie in her justifiably famous TED Talk on portrayals of Africa in the West calls a single story. So that's the language I want to focus on. The language used in these single stories, the language which shapes public knowledge of Africa and which obscures what's actually happening on the continent. And when I talk about this language, the language that people use to describe Africa, I don't specifically mean criticizing the people who attack Africa, who insult Africa, such as the president. That's a problem. The ignorance of people like that, it's reprehensible, it deserves to be condemned. But that's not what I'm talking about, because I think it's kind of odd. I don't know. I'd hope that I don't need to go on at length about how it's stupid and ignorant and racist and so on. So when I talk about the ways that language shapes our understanding, Americans' understanding of Africa, I'm not talking about people who call Africa a shithole. And I'm not talking about the equally ignorant and maybe more widespread problem of media coverage which says that Africa is a single country, which happens a lot. The Wall Street Journal's headline after the tragic plane crash in Ethiopia said that a plane had crashed in Africa. And that sort of thing is seemingly more respectable than the racism of someone like Trump. I don't think the Wall Street Journal would run a headline calling Africa a shithole. But it does reflect a similar degree of ignorance, and it also deserves to be considered reprehensible, but it's still not the focus of my talk. Instead, I'm interested in discussing language about Africa that doesn't seem obviously reprehensible at first glance, the more subtle ways that language shapes people's understanding of the continent. And so there are a few examples I want to highlight. The first is the way that conflicts in Africa are discussed. When conflicts make the news in the US, it's almost invariably done through a standard narrative of incomprehensible violence, usually violence carried out between different tribes whose hatred is simply assumed and never explained. And the language that's used to describe these wars does a lot to subtly reinforce the idea that this conflict is fundamentally incomprehensible. The Indian historian Ranajit Guha has pointed out, in a different context, but the language used to narrate conflict in Africa makes it seem like essentially natural phenomena. Conflicts erupt like a volcano. Conflicts break out like a thunderstorm. Conflicts spread like a wildfire. And in making the causes of those wars seemingly natural and thus incomprehensible, they also make the people who are involved in those wars incomprehensible. In fact, anyone who studies or who has spent time thinking about conflict in Africa could tell you that conflicts are caused by a wide array of factors, as with conflict anywhere in the world. When talking about America's wars, you're never going to hear that kind of language. The media actually explains what's happening. You're never going to hear a newscaster say that drone strikes have erupted in Syria. You're never going to hear a newscaster say that a Navy SEAL raid broke out in Afghanistan. But the language we use to describe wars in other parts of the world, subtly but almost unfailingly, suggests that the causes of those conflicts are unknowable, and because they are unknowable, they are unimportant. And this matters, because saying that war has erupted may seem like just an innocuous use of language. But it has an impact. The writer Hannah Georges just wrote an article in The Atlantic about the way this works and how portraying events in Africa through this sort of language prevents these stories from actually being stories. Because if violence in Africa is portrayed as a fundamentally natural phenomena, then the resulting, and now I'm quoting her, the deaths are not tragedies, they are eventualities. They are facts, they're not stories. I think it, in fact, says something that reporting on wars in Africa resembles reporting on natural disasters in Africa. Both events generate the same types of stories, stories which suggest that Africa is a place where bad things just sort of happen. But when talking about natural disasters, the cause may be natural, but the impact is never determined solely by nature. This is something I have been thinking about a lot recently, because central Mozambique, which is where I do my research, which is a place where I've spent a lot of time, was just devastated by a cyclone. Cyclone Idai, you may have heard of it. The main city in central Mozambique, Beira, second largest city in the country, when the cyclone hit, it passed just north of the city. The winds were well over 100 miles an hour. The Red Cross estimated that 90% of the buildings were damaged or destroyed. They did a follow-up survey which said that 2/3 of the houses had lost their roofs. A third of these houses have suffered structural damage. The city's been devastated, and the region as a whole has been devastated. The cyclone caused massive flooding, which has affected millions of people, displaced over 200,000 people, killed an unknown number, likely to be in the thousands, devastated something like 1,400 square miles of farmland, which is likely to create a lot of problems with hunger going forward, created a lake that was 150 square miles, and this is just in Mozambique. It had equally dramatic impacts in Zimbabwe and Malawi. And so I've been spending a lot of time thinking about the impact of Cyclone Idai, and on the one hand, of course, it is justifiable to call it a natural disaster. A cyclone is a natural phenomenon. But it's also important to remain attentive to the ways that natural disasters are shaped by the human environment in which they occur. In the case of Mozambique, part of the reason that the cyclone was so devastating is that there's basically one road which links Beira to the rest of the country, and a couple of the bridges along that road were washed out by the floods. And this legacy of poor infrastructure has a long, long history. A history that goes back through colonial rule, continues through the regional wars of independence across southern Africa against apartheid and so on. And so because the road was washed out, the only way to bring food in, the main way to bring food in was via helicopter. But Mozambique is a very poor country, again, a consequence of a long history of impoverishment. And so there are only a few helicopters available. Most of them belong to aid agencies or to the South African military. And that matters. That had a big impact on the effects of the cyclone. The people who were the neighborhoods that were most devastated by the cyclone were what people call unofficial neighborhoods, other people call slum housing, built up in Beira along the flood zones where previously people hadn't built because they flood when there's a cyclone. Also people living along the ocean front. And so the disaster of Cyclone Idai may have been natural, but uncritically using this term natural can mean absolving ourselves of thinking difficult thoughts about the political and historical dynamics that make natural disasters as disastrous as they are. Also important is that so central Mozambique gets hit by cyclones, not infrequently, but the reason that Idai was so devastating was because it had a very unusual storm track. I mean, not to bore you with meteorology, but most times cyclones that hit Mozambique, they come in from the ocean and then they hit, and that's it. Idai first hit Mozambique as a tropical depression, not a super serious storm. It caused an initial wave of flooding. Moved back out to sea. Instead of continuing out to sea, it stopped and got stronger and stronger and stronger because the water is warmer than it has been. Then hit Mozambique a second time as a cyclone, and this time is when the flooding was much more serious. This storm track has never been charted before. There's never been a similar storm that did that. And it was influenced a lot by global warming, which is another reason to be cautious when we talk about natural disasters as natural. Or for that matter, global warming. I mean, global is one of those, it's a tricky phrase. The impact of global warming will be felt across the globe, but it will be felt differently. And the causes of global warming are also differentially distributed. The historian Gabriel Hecht said this type of phrase, quote, attributes ecological collapse to an undifferentiated humanity, when in practice both responsibility and vulnerability are unevenly distributed. So that's important to think about when we talk about natural disasters too. Okay, so far I've discussed how the language people use to talk about Africa misrepresents its diversity and distorts its reality, by presenting it as a place where bad things just naturally happen. And now I want to switch gears and talk about the opposite narrative, the narrative of development or progress, which is another widespread trope people use to report about Africa. Because on the one hand, these stories are a refreshing corrective to the sort of doom and gloom stories about war or poverty or disaster. But on the other hand, whenever a professor's talking, there's always going to be on the other hand. That kind of narrative of progress does a lot to occlude the political and social circumstances that have made development into this thing that people automatically assume is good and necessary. In equating the idea of development with the idea of progress, development becomes a universally good thing, because no sentient and rational human being could oppose the idea of progress. Everyone wants people's lives to improve. But when we use this language of development, when development gets used in language that people use to talk about Africa, it's a term that hides a lot of assumptions that don't get examined as critically as they should be. One of those assumptions is that development is something that can be carried out over a whole country, or a whole continent, or even the whole world, rather than actually examining specific groups of people and which specific groups of people will benefit and how they will benefit, because development's impacts are never evenly distributed. But describing it as this sort of uncomplicated, unalloyed progress means ignoring the ways in which development is very intricately linked to political and social divisions. Another assumption is that development is a process that is propelled in whole or in part by some outside actor. Whether it's a government, whether it's a non-governmental organization, whether it's a nonprofit, whether it's an international organization, some combination that suggests it's coming from somewhere else. There's a group of people who need to be developed by someone else. And it suggests that there are vast areas of the world which need outside assistance to catch up, consigning many parts of the world to what the anthropologist Dipesh Chakrabarty has called, quote, history's waiting room. A waiting room from which you really never escape. And above all, it suggests that development, when people present kind of feel-good stories, it suggests that development is something that can and will be accomplished. It's pretty straightforward, maybe even easy, if only it is attempted. And so those assumptions embedded within the language of development, which people so often use to talk about Africa, allows media portrayals of development as something that is happening, or can be, or will be, or should be happening across all of Africa, and thus transforms the political and social complexity of Africa into a simple, single problem that can be fixed with willpower and technical expertise. Fixed with willpower and technical expertise that are going to come from somewhere else. As a historian, I haven't really spoken a whole lot about history. I don't necessarily want this to be a history lecture. But I do feel bound to point out that a lot of this language that I've been discussing has a long history which dates back to colonial rule, and which is worth keeping in mind. Current day portrayals of African violence as fundamentally incomprehensible as this quasi-natural phenomenon has a lot to do with the way that colonial officials describe rebellions against their authority. Because to colonial officials, any challenge to their authority could not be understood. It could only be understood as an incomprehensible expression of irrational violence. The only way colonial officials could understand it was as something that couldn't be explained, something that couldn't be understood. Natural disasters. One of the first natural disasters that colonial authorities sought to address was trypanosomiasis, sleeping sickness, which had a devastating impact on lots of regions of Africa in the first half of the 1900s. But trypanosomiasis was a disease which reached epidemic proportions in significant part because of the violence and dislocation caused by the colonial invasion, which made people much more susceptible to the tsetse fly, which spreads trypanosomiasis. The language of development, too, another inheritance from the colonial era. Development became a watchword in the 1940s, 1950s. When European empires needed to find a new way to justify what they were doing, an alibi to defend European rule in a world that was decolonizing, in a world where European officials had to find new ways to explain what they were doing. And development provided an answer. You know, a language focused on forward movement, on progress, means not talking about what needs to be changed. It means not talking about the social and economic conditions created under colonial rule. It was easier for European colonial officials to talk about where they were going, not where they were. Because if they talked about where their colonies were, that would have meant talking about some unflattering realities. Like the reality that French Equatorial Africa in the 1910s, 1920s, around 65% of the tax revenue was used to pay for the salaries of French colonial officials. Less than 2% spent on health and education. In Nigeria in 1925, less than 2% of the budget spent on education. And so as a result, 1950s, estimated population of sub-Saharan Africa of 200 million people, there were around 8,000 high school graduates. And so that kind of reality made it a lot easier for European colonizers to talk about the language of development. Because development meant talking about the future, not about the present and not about the past. So where does that leave us? Well, I don't know. I don't have a satisfying conclusion to offer, I'm sorry. I want to end. I don't want to keep talking for the whole time. As a scholar, as a historian, I wish that people were attuned to the full historical and social complexity of Africa. That's not the reality. I'm not really optimistic that's going to become the reality. People are busy. News coverage is not real good. The hope that everyone's going to suddenly become aware of the world around us probably isn't realistic. But even if it's not likely that everyone's going to fully grasp the richness and diversity of African social and political and cultural life, at least they can be made aware that it exists. And at least they can be aware that there's more to Africa than what they hear in the public. There's more to know about Africa than the stereotypes that they see in the public sphere. And in seeing the disconnect between the language that people use to talk about Africa and the language used by people in Africa, they might start to critically reflect on the reasons that this disconnect exists, and maybe critically reflect on the ways that media coverage of issues and events in Africa and everywhere else in the world shades people's understanding of the world around them. So not a very good conclusion, but that's where I'm going to leave it. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for having me. Thanks for being here.